You good to start? All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Should we start? Does everyone remember where we left off? Any ideas where we left off? I think Brother Bilal, you're the only one here who's been here consistently. What was the... Hudaybiyah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Remember how the Prophet ﷺ was going to do Umrah, but he couldn't, and they went to the valley of Hudaybiyah, and they stopped there, and they signed the treaty. So now where we are is about 1 year after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Jews of Khaybar, which tribe? Which tribe is the Jews of Khaybar in? Remember there's three Jewish tribes? Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and I've forgotten as well. Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and it's with an N. It'll come to me. Anyway, Banu Nadir were the tribe that got expelled from Medina, and they went to Khaybar, and they started living in Khaybar. Now Khaybar isn't like Mecca or Medina. Mecca or Medina is like a city, right? Khaybar was actually a series of fortresses, small fortresses, and each fortress there were clans from the tribe of Banu Nadir. Different clans would be staying in different fortresses. Now these guys, the Jews of Khaybar, started making problems for the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims. The first problem that they started was they hired a man by the name of Labid. Labid was a famous sorcerer. He was well known for doing black magic. And they hired this man to go and put a spell on the Prophet ﷺ. So suddenly the Prophet's starting to feel quite weak. He starts to forget and he loses his appetite. And he starts making dua, and he gets revelation saying that this is what's happened. This man has put a spell on you, and he's instructed to recite Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. Soon as he starts reciting Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas, he immediately feels the strength come back to him. This is interesting because I've actually heard some Muslims say that, I don't believe in black magic, this is not a thing. But the Prophet ﷺ himself, being a prophet, was affected by it. So the question we ask is, why did Allah allow him to be affected by it? Allahu Alam, I don't know, and I'm not a scholar, but I assume it's for a lesson for us as well, to know how to protect ourselves from the unseen. And the lesson in this was that he was told to recite Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. So Labid is brought before him, and he confesses, and he says, yes, they hired me, they gave me a lot of money to put a spell on you, and I did, and I apologize, and I'm sorry. And the Seerah says that the Prophet ﷺ forgave him. Now, do you remember what the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was? What did the Treaty of Hudaybiyah do? Anyone? Friday? No, not what date, sorry. What did the Treaty of Hudaybiyah do? Like what was the context of it? The Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a treaty between the Meccans and the Muslims, and they made an agreement that they're not going to fight each other. They're not going to fight each other. There's a few other things, like if a Meccan who becomes Muslim comes to the Muslims, then the Muslims have to return back, and vice versa. And that's right. So they wouldn't do Umrah that year, they will come back the next year to do Umrah. So there's a few conditions. But the main condition of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was that there will be a period of peace between the Quraysh in Mecca and the Muslims in Medina. That was very beneficial because when that peace happened, that allowed the Muslims to focus their attention on the other problems that they've got. And these other problems were the Jews of Khaybar and two other tribes called the Banu Ghatafan and the Banu Hawazin. These were Bedouin tribes that were causing problems. They were attacking Muslim caravans and causing all sorts of issues. Now, the Prophet ﷺ gets news that the Jews of Khaybar are now planning, so this is the Banu Nadir, are planning a fight with the Muslims. Remember how I said that the Prophet ﷺ had a really good, strong network of spies and intelligence. So he gets this information. And so he starts preparing to fight Banu Nadir. While the preparations are going on, a poor Sahaba comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, "O Rasulullah, I have no clothes, I have no food. Can you give me something?" And the Prophet ﷺ, in true fashion, his generosity, he gives him one of his best cloaks. And the Sahaba says, I prefer to take one of your old cloaks and some dates. So this was the state. The reason I'm telling you the story is so that you understand the state of the Muslims currently. They had fought many battles, but they were quite financially poor. A lot of the Sahaba were quite financially poor. The Prophet ﷺ gives him one of the new cloaks and gives him the cloak that he asked for and dates, and he says this: if you stay safe and live a little while longer, you will have abundance of provisions and leave abundantly for your family. You shall abound in dirhams and in slaves, and it will not be good for you. It's interesting. He's making a prophecy here. He's saying, if you live a little bit longer, you're going to see the situation change. And this is where the Muslims of Medina are heading. We'll see that before the end of today's story, you'll see how the financial situation of the Muslims changed drastically. Now, while the Prophet ﷺ is preparing to battle Banu Nadir, Abdullah ibn Ubay, who's Abdullah ibn Ubay? I've mentioned him so many times. Anyone? Abdullah ibn Ubay. Everyone looks down. As soon as I say this, they're like something very interesting is happening on the carpet.
The head of the Munafiqeen.
Yes, the head of the Munafiqeen, the hypocrites. He was going to be crowned king of Medina, and this really troubled him that when the Prophet ﷺ came, that he lost that position. Abdullah ibn Ubay sends a secret message to Banu Nadir saying, watch out, the Muslims are about to attack you. They're about to do a preemptive strike. Banu Nadir panics, and they send a message to Banu Ghatafan. Remember the tribe that I told you that's all been causing problems? They send a message to Banu Ghatafan saying, we need your help. And we promise to give you half our harvest every year if you come to our aid. We need reinforcements. Banu Ghatafan responds saying, yes, we'll send you 4,000 men to help you. And while this is happening, Banu Nadir starts to reinforce their fortresses and really defend themselves. With the 4,000 men from Banu Ghatafan, we're now looking at about 14,000 men in Khaybar, preparing for the Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ sends Abdurrahman ibn Auf with 30 men to Khaybar to negotiate them to surrender. Instead of negotiating, it's gone to their head, they've got proud. Instead of negotiating, they actually try to assassinate Abdurrahman. Now this is not only Islamically, but in any sense of that period, trying to kill a diplomat is sacrilegious in any country in that period. So this really angers the Prophet ﷺ, and he says there's no going back now. So he gathers a force of 1,600 men, 1,000 intentionally. So there's 14,000 in Khaybar waiting for him, but he only takes 1,600. Do you know the reason for that? He had more, he had access to more men, but he only chose 1,600. Because there was a verse in the Quran that was interpreted that he was to take only the people who were with him at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That's interesting. So only the Sahaba who were going to do Umrah with him and were there when the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the peace treaty, was written, did Allah give permission to go to war. All other Muslims were required to stay back. Now this really shows you the confidence the Prophet ﷺ had. Obviously he's a prophet, but he's like, I've been instructed to take far smaller army to fight a far bigger army who's already defending behind walls, but that's no problem because the Quran says that we're going to win, so that's it, that's all we're going to do. So he leaves the majority of the Muslims back in Medina and marches out with only 1,600 men to face about 14,000 men. The surah he's talking about is Surah Al-Fatah, chapter 48, verse 15, if any of you guys are taking notes. The Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims arrive at Khaybar, and they start besieging the fortresses. Now, like I said, they were a series of separate independent fortresses. So they had to besiege one fortress, and then another small group would besiege another, and so on and so forth. But so far, the Banu Ghatafan has not arrived yet. So they've sent message saying, we're coming to help you, but they haven't arrived yet. But even without Banu Ghatafan, just the tribe of Banu Nadir outnumbers the Muslims significantly. But there's a problem. Each fortress is acting on its own. They're not coordinating with each other, and they're kind of infighting as well. So they all decide, because they don't trust each other, to stay within their own fortress and wait till the Banu Ghatafan comes and does their dirty job for them. Meanwhile, in the desert, Banu Ghatafan has now, the 4,000 men are setting off and heading towards Khaybar. Halfway there, they suddenly hear a voice in the desert, a loud voice screaming, "Your people, your people." They panic. They think that someone's attacking their homes and their families. So they turn around and they march back home. By the time they get back home, they realize nothing's happened. They're all safe. But then they discuss amongst themselves and say, well, it's too late now. If we go all the way back there, the battle's already finished. We're not going to get the loot. Remember, they were mercenaries. They weren't doing this because they cared for Banu Nadir. We're not going to get money. We'll just stay home. So it's very interesting. One voice in the desert suddenly halves the number of Banu Nadir, almost halves the number of Banu Nadir. And the Banu Ghatafan, even though they promised, never come to their aid. So slowly, one by one, the fortresses start to fall. They run out of food, and several times they're assaulted, and the Muslims take charge of these fortresses one by one, starting with the smallest and the weakest, and slowly working their way up. When they reach one of the bigger fortresses, the stronger ones, the Prophet ﷺ says, "Tomorrow I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and His Messenger, and Allah and His Messenger loves him." Anyone know who this man is? Ali. This is a very famous hadith that the Shias like to use and refer to, saying that the Prophet ﷺ chose Ali. One of the evidences that the Prophet ﷺ chose Ali. I'm not going to get into the whole Shia Sunni thing. That will be a whole different topic on its own. But this is one hadith that they refer to. But it did happen. The Prophet ﷺ gave the banner to Ali, despite the fact that there were many Sahaba who were more older than him, who were more experienced in military battles. He was given the banner and he assaults the fortress. Now this is where, I don't know if you guys have heard about the strength of Ali. Do you know the example of where the strength of Ali comes in? Anyone know what happened in this assault? The door. That's right. So they assault and they break the door down, and he's lost his shield, so he picks up the entire door and uses it as a shield. Later, after the battle, it took several men to lift the door. Was it adrenaline rush or was it from Allah? Allahu Alam. But Ali was able to use the entire door as a shield when assaulting the fortress.
I heard he just opened the door for them, like he didn't use it as a shield.
I heard he used it as a shield, but maybe there's a different view on that. I heard that he literally picked the handle up and was swinging it around like a thing. But Allahu Alam. So, after each of the fortresses fall one by one, they get to one of the fortresses that is owned or occupied by the clan of Kina ibn Abu Hakaya. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Now, the clan of Kina was one of the most wealthy clans of Banu Nadir. And so while they're being besieged and they're waiting for Banu Ghatafan, they start to realize they're not getting any reinforcements. Banu Ghatafan's not coming. So they say, look, let's go and try to negotiate. So they send messages to the Prophet ﷺ and they say, we want to negotiate. Finally, after a bit of backwards and forwards, they come to an agreement that no one will be harmed. The clan of Kina can leave. However, all the wealth that belongs to them, and they're one of the wealthiest clans, remember? All the wealth has to be left behind. They cannot take the wealth with them. And part of the agreement is that if anyone tries to hide this wealth, they would be executed. As they're preparing to lead, one of the leaders of the clan decides to hide the wealth, and he is caught. The wealth is found, and he is executed. The reason why I say this is that one of the things that a lot of Orientalists like to say is that the Prophet ﷺ executed people left, right, and center. He didn't. If you look at the Seerah very carefully, remember we talked about the execution of which tribe? Banu Qurayza, remember? That's one that people say a lot, oh, he killed the entire clan. Well, no, he didn't. First of all, it was fighting men. The women and children were not killed. The second thing was that Banu Qurayza actually chose the punishment for themselves. They chose the judge, they chose the law, and they made an agreement for that, and so that agreement had to be followed. Similarly, in this case, the execution happened based on an agreement and law that they agreed to. It was always just, and there was always a reason. It was never done out of spite or anger. It wasn't like the Mongols who come and just kill to cause fear. The Prophet ﷺ never ever did that. Now, when news of this reaches the last two remaining fortresses, they also surrender. But they agree to pay tribute. They say, we will stay in our fortresses, we'll stay where we are, but we will pay you an yearly tribute. The Prophet ﷺ agrees, but one of the conditions he says is that at any point, if there is treachery, he is allowed to kick them out pretty much. And they agree to that condition. Now, so what caused the fall of Khaybar and the end of the Jewish autonomy in Arabia? This is what the book says. The lack of fundamental unity among the Jews was a weakness which meant that it was easy for Muhammad to find Jews who were ready to help him. The Arab allies of the Jews too, being attached to them chiefly by bribes, were easily detached. Partly by fear of the Muslims' reprisals and partly by Muhammad's diplomatic skills. The fall of Khaybar and the surrender of the other Jewish colonies marked the end of the Jewish question during the Prophet's lifetime. For the expulsion of the Jews from the Hijaz by the Caliph Omar belongs to a later history. The Jews had opposed Muhammad to the utmost of their ability, and they had been utterly crushed. Many still remained in their former homes in Medina and elsewhere, but they had lost much of their wealth and they had become politically weak. Now, there's also a view, and this is again an Orientalist view, that the Prophet ﷺ exiled or kicked out all the Jews there and it was just racism. This is not true. We're actually quite close to the end of the Seerah, but even then, he followed through the treaties, but there were still Muslims living in Medina even at this point, and even some of the tribes that made the agreement, they still remain in Khaybar. So it was the expulsion of the Jews completely from the Arabian Peninsula, from the Hijaz, actually happened during Umar's time, completely. During the Prophet's time, there's still a lot of Jewish families still living there. Now, when we talk about Khaybar, a question that comes up a lot is, even amongst Muslims, and I've heard this a lot, is this concept that the Jews are bad. They're bad, they always oppose the Prophet ﷺ, and they always fought the Prophet ﷺ. And I can see why people feel that way, and I can see why you start to think that way, because of when we hear the story. If I had stopped here, if I had stopped the Seerah here, you'd probably go home thinking that the Jews of Medina and the Hijaz, and maybe perhaps even generally, are not very nice people. But that's not where it stops. And we'll see more, and if we follow that the Prophet ﷺ always judged an individual on the individual, not for who the group they were part of, or the community, or even their religion. Anyhow, once Khaybar was now in the hands of the Muslims, the Muslims decide to prepare a feast to celebrate. And they roast the lamb and they bring it to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet takes one bite of the lamb and spits it out immediately. And he says, I've just received revelation that this food has been poisoned. And the Prophet ﷺ asks, who make this food? They say that it was one of the widows from the Jewish tribes, from one of the Jewish widows. So they asked for the cook to be brought before him. And he says, why did you do this? We have a treaty. We're not slaughtering you. The battle is over. Why did you decide to poison the food? And her response is, you Muslims killed my father, you killed my husband, you killed my uncle. So I decided that if you were not a prophet and I poisoned you, you would die and I would be doing everyone a favor because I would have killed a false prophet. But if you were a prophet, you would get revelation and you'd be warned about it and you wouldn't eat. So no problem either way. This was her logic. Now, a Sahaba by the name of Bishr ibn Bara also had eaten this lamb, and he had actually swallowed it and he passed away. Now here in this point there is two differing views that we get. Some Seerah sources say that the Prophet ﷺ actually understood her logic and forgave her. Other sources say that the Prophet ﷺ did not forgive her and she was executed, but not for poisoning him, but for the death of the Sahaba. And this is again another very common theme. The Prophet ﷺ never punished anyone for a personal attack on him. He couldn't care less about personal attacks on him. If there was a punishment, it was because a treaty was broken, a law was broken, an agreement was broken, or because there was a direct attack or a threat on Islam or the community. For himself, he never took any action or any consequence. So even according to the sources of Seerah that say that the woman was executed, it was because she caused the death of another person, not for trying to poison him. Now, as the Muslims are packing up and they're preparing to go back to Medina, one of the widows of the Kinna clan, Safiya bint Huway, who's this? Safiya bint Huway. Anyone know who this is? I think you know, Sami, because you're nodding. Anyone else know who she is? You have an idea? That's right. Safiya bint Huway was a Jewish person from Banu Nadir and from the Kinna clan, the clan that was trying to hide the wealth. Her husband had just been killed. She was one of the widows. She comes to the Prophet ﷺ secretly, and he says, I have had a dream and I need to tell you about it. He said, I saw a dream that a bright, very, very bright moon rose out of Medina and came to Khaybar, and then it landed on my lap. And the Prophet ﷺ says, I give you two options. You can become Muslim and I will take you as my wife, or you can remain as you are and I will return you safely to your people. Safiya accepts Islam and becomes a Muslim. Now, this is where I said that if we continue with the Seerah, you'll see. Be very careful, in my opinion, and I'm not a scholar, so I'm not going to give fatwas or anything, obviously not, but I think we have to be very, very careful when we say negative things about particular Jewish groups, because one, there are fatwas that racism is haram in Islam, but two, Judaism is not only a religion, it's an ethnicity, it's a group, it's an ethnic group. And Safiya, our mother, was Jewish. She became Muslim later, but her ethnicity didn't change, she was still Jewish. Similarly, the great Sahaba, Abdullah ibn Salam, the rabbi, he became Muslim, but he was still Jewish. And the Prophet ﷺ loved both of these people very, very dearly. So this is something to bear in mind. The Prophet ﷺ never reacted to an individual based on what community or group they were part of. He reacted to their own personal actions, but not to who they belonged to. This is an example. So Safiya was an example. We'll cover a bit more later. I'll get to that. I'll get to that. That's what I said will come in a second. I think I know what you're talking about. We'll get to that. If I'm not, then just tell me what you were going to say. So Safiya becomes one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. On their way back, there were other smaller Jewish tribes that the Prophet ﷺ's army met, and they agreed to surrender almost immediately without any fight, and also give tribute. After the campaign of Khaybar, the Muslims returned back to Medina more wealthy than they have ever been. And literally overnight, the economic situation in Medina changes drastically. They were a political force prior, they were a military force, but they were not wealthy. No one considered them wealthy. Suddenly, the Muslims have become incredibly wealthy. And what the Prophet ﷺ told that Sahaba, that if you should live a little longer, you will not be in need of any dirhams or any slaves, but it's not going to be good for you. I think it's almost like a prophecy for the entire Muslim community. If you look at Islamic history, you see that the Muslims, they start off poor and humble, and they get more and more powerful, more and more wealth. But as they get richer and richer, Islam starts to get reduced. And then they reach a peak, and then it always dips down. The Mughals, the Ottomans, any of those Islamic empires, if you look at it, it always works that way. So I always like to think that the Prophet ﷺ, when he said that to the Sahaba, was not only saying that to the Sahaba, but he's also saying to the Muslim community as a whole. When Safiya returns to Medina with the Prophet ﷺ and goes and lives amongst the other wives, she is not happy. All the other wives start to pick on her. They say things like, you are just a Jew, you're from Banu Nadir, your father was part of the Kinna clan that tried to hide the wealth. And at one point, one of the wives says, you're just a Jew. So the wife, the Safiya, goes to the Prophet ﷺ in tears and says, the other wife said this, complains to her. And this, I love this story because this really shows you the character of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ looks at her and smiles and says, oh Safiya, why didn't you say thank you to them? And Safiya is shocked and says, why would I say thank you? He's like, Safiya, they just said that your father, Harun, was a prophet, your uncle Musa was a prophet, your husband, me, is a prophet. What greater status is there than to be called a Jew? This makes her incredibly happy, but this really shows you the character of the Prophet, but also how he thought about different community groups. For those of us who think that somehow Muslims are anti-Jewish, you just need to hear this story of how the Prophet ﷺ, despite everything, and the reality is the Jewish tribes were one of the most hostile towards him, but despite that, he saw the Jewish people as descendants of the prophets and therefore of requiring honor, and that's what he told Safiya as well. And after that, Safiya didn't mind at all, even though the wives possibly continued calling her names, she embraced it. Any questions so far? Because I'm going through this fairly fast, and we might end a little bit early, but if you have any questions, we can deal with that. Okay.
Can you repeat those tribes, the names of the 3 tribes?
Banu Nadir. Banu means tribe. So the tribe of Nadir, Banu Kainuka, and what was the third tribe? Qurayza. Banu Qurayza, Banu Kainuka, and Banu Nadir. The 3 Jewish tribes of Medina. And if you remember going back to the Seerah, they were the ones who were almost in control of Medina. They held the finances of Medina. By this time, when we get to Khaybar, like I read, the power of the Jewish tribes are completely gone. They have almost no power. With the household of the Prophet ﷺ now growing, jealousy begins to form. And a lot of the wives start to get quite jealous of Aisha radiallahu anha, because she is the most favored. The Prophet ﷺ loves her the most. But Aisha was only jealous of one person. Anyone know who Aisha was jealous of? Khadija. Aisha, despite the fact that now it's been many, many, many years that Khadija has passed away, Aisha still remains very, very jealous of Khadija. One point, the Prophet ﷺ is going through some of the belongings of Khadija and finds it, and he starts crying. And Aisha says, why are you crying? You should be happy. Allah's given you a younger, more beautiful, more better wife. And the Prophet says, there is no better wife. There is never a better wife than Khadija, and kind of puts her in her place. But Aisha kind of comes to terms with this. Aisha narrates later that once Khadija's sister visited us, and she was outside the door speaking to someone, and the Prophet ﷺ was inside and heard her, and he begins to tremble. He's literally trembling with grief. And Aisha says the reason was Khadija's sister's voice sounded very similar to Khadija's voice. If you want a romantic love story, there's no better one than that between Khadija and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Many years later, his heart, despite having all these wives, and he loved them all, his heart was always fixated on Khadija. So this bickering was happening between the wives, backwards and forwards, and he knew of this. He usually didn't get involved. For example, some of the wives asked Fatima to come and tell the Prophet ﷺ that they wanted more time with him. He's spending too much time with Aisha, and his response was, I'm spending time with people as I see fairly, you guys go sort it out. Don't drag me into this. But he saw this, and sometimes he would try to diffuse the situation, and how he did that was with jokes. One point he was in a gathering with all his wives, and he had a necklace with him, and he said, I'm going to give this necklace to the one I love the most beloved of me. And obviously you can imagine all the wives start bristling, and all their jealousy starts picking up again. And he takes it and he laughs and he gives it to his granddaughter, just to kind of give a bit of a hint to the wives that you can bicker all you want, but my love is to the people that I love, and in this case it was his granddaughter. Anyone know what the granddaughter's name was? The only granddaughter. Anyone know what her name was? Most people don't. I didn't know before I started. Umama. He had one granddaughter called Umama, in which he loved dearly. We know there's many stories of him playing and showing a lot of love to Hassan and Hussein, but similarly he showed a lot of love to this granddaughter Umama. Now, the issue of Ghatafan was still there. This tribe had allied themselves with Banu Nadir for money to try and attack the Muslims, and they were still there. Now, all the other enemies have kind of been controlled. The Banu Nadir, the Jewish tribes that were hostile to him are gone. The Quraysh can't do anything because there's a treaty. So the remaining power that can be a threat to the Muslim is Banu Ghatafan. Similar to Banu Nadir, news reaches the Prophet ﷺ that Banu Ghatafan is also planning an attack on Medina. So what he does is he plans a preemptive strike. When you read the Seerah, you see that the Prophet ﷺ did this quite often. He would take preemptive strikes. Before they can attack, they get attacked. And the Muslims are actually very well known for being lightning fast when they attack someone. So an urgent, part of the expedition to placate or to control Banu Ghatafan, there were several expeditions that happened. But one of them was that news reached the Prophet ﷺ that Banu Ghatafan was going to attack a Jewish tribe by the name of Fadak. This Jewish tribe had made a treaty with the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ attacked Banu Ghatafan to protect the Jewish tribe. This is another example of whoever thinks about ethnicity over religion, bear in mind the Prophet ﷺ chose to protect the Jewish people in this situation against the Arab Bedouins because there was a treaty and it was the right thing to do. He didn't consider ethnicity. During this expedition, the Usama, who's Usama? Very famous Sahaba. He was known as Usama bin Zayd. He was known as the beloved, the son of the beloved, because the Prophet ﷺ loved Zayd immensely. And Usama was Zayd's son. A little bit side note, Zayd, remember Zayd? Zayd ibn Harith. Anyone know who Zayd ibn Harith was? So I covered this very early on in the Seerah. Who was Zayd ibn Harith to the Prophet ﷺ? He was, but he was also, that's right. That's right. So Zayd ibn Harith, when he was visiting his family with his mother's family, his mother's family was attacked and he was taken as a slave and sold into slavery. And he was later sold to Khadija. And then when the Prophet ﷺ married Khadija, we're talking when Zayd was a very young boy. He was very, very little. He was given as a slave, as a gift to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ immediately frees him and raises him as his own child, and then later adopts him. And for quite a while, he was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. When the revelation came that you have to call the children by their father's name, that's when he was referred to again as Zayd ibn Harith. When his father found out that Zayd was with the Prophet ﷺ, his father and his uncle actually came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, I would like to take my son back. And the Prophet called Zayd and said, your father's here, would you like to go back with him? And Zayd said, after having spent time with you, there is no way I can choose anyone over you, even if it's my father. And he tells his father, I'm sorry, but I cannot come back with you. I'm staying with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. That gives you an indication of the love that the Prophet ﷺ had. Anyhow, Zayd was known as the beloved of the Prophet. Zayd was married initially to, anyone know who he was initially married to? Not Sophia, but it was his cousin. Zainab bin Jash, the Prophet ﷺ's first cousin. Zainab bin Jash and Zayd were not a good match. The Prophet ﷺ was the one who encouraged the marriage, but they always did not get along. And they ended up divorcing. When they divorced, the Prophet ﷺ asked Zayd to marry second wife. Anyone know?
The smart no?
Who was the second wife that Zainab married? That Usama was born from. Very famous Sahabi. Zayd's second wife. Umayman. Umayman, also known by the name Baraka. Baraka, the nurse that was there with the Prophet ﷺ from the beginning. The slave, she was dark-skinned and she was a slave, and Zayd was married to Umayman, and they were very happy together, and they had the famous son Usama, and Usama becomes a very famous person. Now, I've gone off on a tangent, but why we're talking about Usama was when they attacked Banu Ghatafan. This is where Usama, who was 17 years old at the time, was fighting one of the people of Ghatafan, and he falls over, and Usama goes to kill him. And this person says, stop, I give the Shahada. But Usama continues and kills him. He comes and tells the Sahaba, and the Sahaba say, well, you did something really wrong. You're in big trouble now. And the news goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and Usama comes before him, and he is angry. And we know from the Seerah, when the Prophet ﷺ gets angry, one of the nerves pops out from his forehead, and he is that angry. And Usama says, but he didn't mean it. He didn't know anything about Islam. He was lying. He just did it to save his own life. And the Prophet says, did you cut open his chest and look at his heart to know if he meant it or not? It's not your place to judge. And I guess this is a really good lesson for us as well. Sometimes we take what people say and we say, well, we put a backstory to it and say, yeah, it's because of that. He didn't really mean it. Islamically, the ruling is that you take a person as you see them. And if they give the shahada and they say they're a Muslim, you take it as they are Muslim. It's not for us to judge. And that ruling, most scholars take the ruling from this particular incident. Now, like I said, this was a time of great prosperity for the Muslims. A lot of wealth. They were getting yearly tributes from all the Jewish tribes who were themselves wealthy, and they had taken a lot of loot when they defeated these tribes in Khaybar. Because of this wealth, people were starting to ask the Prophet ﷺ for things. They'd come and say, previously these people would be asking for dates and used robes. Now they're coming to the Prophet ﷺ and asking for camels. One such person who asked for camels was Umayman, again, Baraka. He comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, O Rasulullah, I would like a camel that I can ride on, to ride. And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, I'm going to give you a baby of a she-camel. And Umayman says, well, what's the use of a baby of a she-camel? I can't ride a baby of a she-camel. I want a camel to ride. And the Prophet ﷺ smiles, and then he laughs and he says, but isn't every camel a baby of a she-camel? The thing that I say, it's a very small story, but the reason I say this is so you understand the character of the Prophet ﷺ. Some people think he's very serious. He wasn't. We have another issue, I think, in our community, that more religious people become, the more serious they become. They don't joke, they don't laugh. The Prophet was never like that. He laughed, he cracked jokes, he picked on his Sahaba in a good way. He never lied. Even in his joking, he never lied. But he would pick on them, and they would sometimes pick on him, and he would laugh about it. He would run races with Aisha. He would roll on the ground with Hassan and Hussein. There is a story where he had Hussein on his shoulders and he was pretending to be a horse in front of all the Sahaba. He was galloping around. Can you imagine that? The Prophet. And Abu Bakr comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, Ya Rasulullah, what a beautiful rider you have. He says to Hussein, what a beautiful horse you have. And Hussein says, and the Prophet ﷺ says, no, what a beautiful rider the horse has. This was the character of the Prophet. There was another story where he was rolling on the ground playing with Hassan and Hussein. And a Bedouin comes to him and he says, I have 6 children. I don't do this with my children, almost arrogantly. I don't roll on the ground. And the Prophet looks up to him and he says, what can I do if Allah has not put mercy in your heart? We have to remember this. The reason I say this is because we learn the nature of the Prophet. He was a very jovial person. They say that when you walked in and he was sitting by himself, you would think he was the saddest person in the earth. He was so serious. But when you went up to him and you spoke to him, He smiled so big that you would think he's the happiest person in the world. This was his nature. And this was his personality. So we also have to remember that sometimes even with hardship, and the Prophet ﷺ had more hardship than any one of us here, he also had time to laugh and to play and to joke. Now, around this time, remember the last time we did the Seerah, I talked about the treaties, the letters that were sent to different people. One of the letters was sent to the leader of Egypt, the Coptic leader of Egypt. And in response, do you know what the Coptic leader of Egypt did? What did he do? Some seers actually say it's slave, but some seers say it was a noble woman of Egypt. Either way, they sent to the Prophet ﷺ a woman who was by the name of, what was her name? Maria the Copt. And the Prophet ﷺ marries Maria the Copt. And she becomes one of the wives. Similar to when Safiya comes to the group of wives, when Maria comes, there is jealousy again. And there's infighting, and there's arguing, and then they don't like Maria being there. And they keep bickering and they keep telling the Prophet ﷺ, you shouldn't spend time with her, you should spend time with us. So just to stop the bickering, just to stop the arguments, the Prophet ﷺ distanced himself from Maria. And in response, Surah At-Tahrim is revealed, which in summary says that what is made permissible to you, don't make impermissible. Maria is one of your wives. Do not push her away. Do any of you guys remember throughout the Seerah, and I'm kind of recapping because we're getting to the end of the Seerah, how many times did the Prophet ﷺ get reprimanded through revelation? This is one, light reprimanded, but there were several other times. The big one, does anyone remember the big one where he got reprimanded? What was the reprimand at Battle of Badr? Yeah, that was the one that sticks to me. Remember when he's talking to a delegation from Mecca and the blind Sahaba comes to talk to him and he turned away, and the revelation comes that it was wrong for you to turn away and choose these people who were hostile towards Islam and ignore this person who dedicated his life to Islam. And I've heard, and I haven't seen it as a source, but I've heard from a friend of mine that when that revelation came, it was actually very, very difficult for the Prophet ﷺ physically. We know that when the Prophet ﷺ gets revelation, it comes in different ways. Sometimes it comes very light on him. Sometimes it's so heavy that if he's riding a camel, the camel falls to the ground. He sinks because he can't carry the weight of the Prophet. Zayd once narrated that he was sitting cross-legged with the Prophet and the Prophet's leg was on his thigh. And suddenly revelation came and Zayd said, I thought my thigh bone was going to snap. He said, I tried to push the Prophet off me, but he was so heavy, I couldn't push him off me. The weight of the revelation. This particular one, when he got reprimanded, I've heard, was very, very hard on him physically. But the prisoners of war, yes, that was another one. Also the time when the hypocrites were being buried. And the Prophet ﷺ, I think, tried to make dua for the hypocrites or something like that. I can't remember the details, but there was another reprimand. That's right. That was a bit of reprimand, and this is another. So never think that the Prophet ﷺ was above the instructions from Allah in the Quran. Even he got told off sometimes and got told to do things differently.
What is the surah?
Surah At-Tahrim. Now, when this verse comes, the Prophet ﷺ, when he gets reprimanded, he takes it very seriously. It really troubles him. And in this situation as well, he got very, very troubled. And he gets very annoyed with his wives. He's like, look what's happened. Because of your bickering and you telling me these things, revelation has come down, now reprimanding me. And so he gets very annoyed with them and stays away from them. One source that I've read is that Aisha and Hafsa, they were best friends. They got along very well. They come up with a plan, and because they're jealous of Maria, they said, when the Prophet ﷺ comes to me, I'm going to say, oh, you smell really bad, your breath smells bad, I don't want you to come close to me. And then when he comes to you, Hafsa, you do the same. So they come up with this little plan to make the Prophet ﷺ feel bad because they're jealous. And this happens. And you know that Prophet ﷺ was very, very particular on smells. And he always made sure that he smelled very good. So this really troubled him. He finds out that this is not the truth, that these two wives of his was doing this out of jealousy. And he gets so angry that he says, I am staying away from you. I'm staying away from the whole lot of you. And he goes and he stays with one of the Sahaba for an entire month. He does not come to Hafsa or Aisha and doesn't speak to them, doesn't talk to them. And to the point that the Sahaba start saying that the Prophet ﷺ has divorced Aisha and Hafsa. And no one has the courage to go to and ask him except Omar. Omar goes up to him, Omar being the father of Hafsa, goes to him and says, have you divorced my daughter and Aisha? And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, I haven't divorced them, but I'm staying away from them because of this. And later he goes back. So if you guys have bickering and issues and fighting in the house, also know that the Prophet ﷺ had the same problems and the same issues with his family. The reason I kind of emphasize this now is because we've seen the Prophet as a military leader, we've seen him as a political leader, we've seen him as a soldier, but we also have to see him as a husband and a father and a grandfather and a friend, and how he dealt with all these different relationships, because this is also part of the Sunnah. And inshallah, we will stop here. Just to let you know, we will go after Isha. Some of us will go for rashes. Also, if you are able to, please make sure you come to the next two Seerahs. We will probably only have 2 more, maybe 3 more, and then it finishes. So if you've missed any of the Seerahs, I really strongly recommend you not miss the next 2 or 3 that's coming up. Assalamu alaikum.